Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me thank the Internet Society for the opportunity to work on the report, also for the opportunity to present the report here. I would like to start by phrasing what Wadi Hadid was saying. If ICT is the answer, what is the question? So if I'm starting this presentation with three major questions. Why the internet is actually important for education in the region, what is going on in the region with regards to internet for education, what gaps are there, and then how can policymakers really help reduce the barriers of integrating ICT in education. So basically all the presentation revolve around these three major questions. I think we all know the challenges that are facing education in Africa. The major challenges are normally in terms of access, equity, and inclusion, as described by UNESCO. I think access is one of the biggest challenges at the moment, because the majority of youth are not able to go to school. There are about 34 million young people of primary education age that are out of school, around 39 million that are in the age around the secondary age that are not going to school. And then those who went to school have also a lot of challenge, because classes tend to be large and children tend to walk long distances to school, and sometimes these children are just going to school hungry. So the challenges are really enormous. In some places, families are really stretched because they have to really cater for school supplies, fees, and so on and so on. And in some countries where we have conflict and hotspots, the education tend to be disrupted. So the challenges are really enormous. And there are also inclusion issues related to gender. Women and girls tend to stay at home relative to boys. Of course, there are also challenges related to people with disabilities in the region, where the majority could not actually walk to the school because there are long distance to walk to the school, and then of course the facilities do not cater to their special needs. Education is not only about access, it's also about quality. As all of you know, quality depends on the capacity of teachers, the quality of teachers, and the motivation of teachers. And many of our countries are actually facing shortage of teachers, basically shortage of quality of teachers. And then of course there are issues related to teaching materials. And one of the growing challenges in Africa at the moment is that a lot of young people leave secondary school and do not have a path to employment, and then basically remain unemployed. I think a lot of countries have this pressure. I come from Ethiopia, and they have really a lot of pressure at the moment, and millions of children, millions of secondary school graduates are just simply unemployed. And then of course, one of the reasons for that is the places in tertiary education are very limited, and then the opportunities for the jobs are very limited. I think all these challenges are very well known. Everybody knows. And then a lot of governments have been working on, United Nations, UNESCO, World Bank, and a lot of institutions like Commonwealth of Learning. They have been working on this project for a longer period. I think what is quite interesting at this time is because the Sustainable Development Goals are trying to articulate these challenges and setting targets for the countries really to commit and to move forward. The SDGs basically, for the first time, bring all layers of education, from pre-primary to universities and to technical and vocational education, and also focus on the transformative nature of education, and then of course lifelong learning, and then learning for work and life. And then the SDGs basically focus also on the quality and also the learning outcomes. This is for the first time. I think the opportunity is there for the countries to move forward. Of course, the SDGs set a lot of targets by 2030, and those targets, as we have heard this morning, may not be achieved in African countries, even in the most advanced countries. So there is a need to change from business as usual to somehow a different way of extending access to education. Of course, ICT can help. If directed well, ICT can help to improve quality of education and also access to education. What ICT does, in principle, is advancing the channel for learning. One of the things that ICT does is basically advancing the channel of learning, hybrid learning, online learning, and so on and so on. And research shows that the African countries at the moment spend about 5% of the GDP on education. And this is somehow comparable to Europe and North Africa. So there isn't enough resources to expand infrastructure in Africa at the moment. So we have to really look at innovative solution of leveraging information and communication technology in terms of reducing cost, in terms of also bringing access to education for people who traditionally were not able to access to education. Of course, there are also opportunities on to the internet, because there is a growing now availability of courses online, which are not only providing access to the latest technologies, the latest tools, but also bringing also the latest insights. If you, for instance, MOOCs such as EDX, which are sponsored by the Ivy League institution like Harvard, like Massachusetts Institute of Technology, actually allows not only the training or education, but also to the newest insights. So we think that the technologies are really very useful for increasing also the capacity of teachers, at the same time also improving the access to knowledge and collaboration. I think most of us who have worked on the National Research and Education Network over the last couple of years have seen that in Africa, the level of collaboration between scientists, the level of access to knowledge, and then the level of access to, for instance, scientific gateways have been improving in some of the countries in Africa that have really good national education research network. So the opportunities are actually there. And one of the opportunity that we can tap into is the number of people that have access to the internet at the moment. Worldwide, about 50% of the population have some form of access to the internet. In Africa, about a third of the population has internet. Of course, the majority of these are social media users. But we can actually use these access to improve access to education. Another opportunity that we see in the region is the growing capacity in terms of international bandwidth, in terms of access to international bandwidth over the last couple of years, especially since 2009, where most of the submarine cables came into the continent. But although this capacity is there, and most of these countries were not able to really leverage this capacity. We did a small study recently in the Gambia, where we just found out that only 5% of the available capacity is currently being used, due to various reasons, obviously, due to the strong monopoly, governance issues, and various reasons, various bottlenecks. And of course, there are also other bottlenecks in terms of use of the available networks, because either the access network locally are not available, or the national backbones are not widely available in some countries, especially in the Central African region, in countries like Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, and most of these countries do not have really the adequate infrastructure that will allow them to really distribute the connectivity to schools and so on. It's also important to note that Africa is not the same across the board, and the policies, the regulatory frameworks are different. What is interesting from this ITU graph is that most of the countries in the middle of Africa, up from Libya down to Angola, and then of course across from Liberia down to Somalia, those countries have a lot of challenges in terms of improving access to the internet. It is in these countries where we have maybe more than 90% of the population does not have access to the internet. Those countries on the top, like Tunisia, Algeria, and then of course Morocco, as well as South Africa and also Kenya. These are the countries. I don't see Rwanda in there, but I think this one of the countries. These are the countries that are really advancing forward in terms of providing access to the internet. Of course, there are other multitude of challenges. The cost of the internet due to market structure and taxes. Locally relevant content is not generally available. We have seen a study on Rwanda on the situation of local content. Only about 13%, as the minister was describing, is just locally hosted. And then of course there are also limited skills in the ministries of education, for instance, that seem to be very stretched into on various issues like expanding school salaries for teachers and so on, and not really having the expertise to implement ICT projects. Of course, one of the challenges that this continent is facing is the supportive infrastructure, the electricity. Across in Burundi, for instance, only 7% of the population have access to electricity. It is really very challenging to expand connectivity in Burundi, or in Southern Sudan, where it's about only 4.5% of the population have access to electricity. Financial constraints are also the major challenge. But I think the people are not really sitting there complaining. All of us have been really doing something. Although these challenges are there, I think what is going on at the moment is that people are not complaining. What has been happening over the last couple of years is that at the end of 1990s and early 2000s, there has been a lot of effort around SchoolNet in Africa, basically building infrastructure into the schools, connecting secondary schools, especially selecting some of these league schools and then connecting them to the internet and so on. And then along with that, there was a lot of work around expanding boundaries to the universities. We have seen a bit of change around 2010, that we have to look at other things related to ICT access to education, not only the infrastructure, but also teachers' capacity development, learning content, because after this discussion on learning content, especially following the Paris Declaration on open educational resources, there's a lot of interest in learning content. For instance, the establishment of Open Educational Resource Africa, OER Africa, and then also looking at infrastructure and tools which are available to teachers on the classroom. For instance, things like one laptop per child that really seem to expand access not only at the lab level but also at the school levels. And then we have seen a parallel development in the National Research and Education Network in Africa. Very exciting development by the Ubuntu Net Alliance, WACREN, and ASREN. So we have seen really a lot of activities going on, some of them on a general education level, some of them on a higher education level. Those two are not really coordinated over the last couple of years. I think what this framework that we put together basically looking at is that we have to look at education as a holistic, across the board of education, across all layers of education, and based on learning from experience from other countries. Countries like Uruguay, countries like Portugal that have really advanced a lot. And then massive investment is required, because if we really look at the whole range of studies or education, then I think there is a lot of massive investment. I think the minister was saying that we shouldn't really look at the next million, but on the last million. If we look at the last million, I think there is a huge investment that is required. So the framework we put forward is just based on some of the study by UNESCO in terms of measurement of what ICT supposed to do, but I think we have to look at the whole range of education, starting from those people who are out of school, at workplace, and then those who will be able to learn formally and formally, integrating it also to higher education, also technical and vocational education, which is normally forgotten. I was doing this study, but it kind of sounds to me that the technical and vocational education component of ICT integration tend to be forgotten because there was a focus for many institutions on the general education, K-12 type of education and so on. So the framework basically kind of provides that there should be a lot of stakeholders that should be involved, and then we have to not only looking at people who are in educational establishment, but also those outside of educational establishment, and at the same time also focus on pedagogical processes and the content, the competencies of teachers and attitude. To do this, I think there is at least three things that should be done, and the Internet Society provides those three things that should be done in the ISOC Enabling Policy Framework. There's a document outside. Basically, what the policy framework suggests is that countries and policymakers should really work hard to expand infrastructure. This can only be done through improved policy frameworks such as transparent licensing framework, market-based spectrum frameworks, infrastructure sharing, simplified right-of-way, and so on and so on. At the same time, countries really need to work to improve the skills at all levels. The skills to maintain ICT systems at the school level, also the skills to really have a vision and then also implement large-scale and massive projects that bring impact into education. More importantly, the Internet Society frameworks basically suggest that countries really need to develop well-articulated policies and plans and then ensure that these are implemented through a multi-stakeholder partnership. We basically focused on this document on what this policy framework for ICT in education would look like and how this could be implemented in a multi-stakeholder fashion. So we came up with about 10 aspects that this policy framework should look at: infrastructure, teachers' professional development, and then also capacity building for decision makers, college and school leaders. Because we found out that some of the gains that would have been made by ICT in education in Africa tend to be blocked by the decision makers, sometimes at the school level, sometimes at the college level. So these really capacity building for these groups of people is very, very useful for in some countries to move forward. Then the framework look at learning resources, content and application, within also the framework of the UNESCO Paris Declaration for the OER, which was discussed this morning, and then also look at skills for employment, stimulation of national research and education network, equity and inclusion, and then also look at the safety, the privacy, child protection issues in online environment. I think this has been mentioned by UNESCO this morning. This is a growing area where the policymakers have not been paying attention in Africa, and it's very important. And then, of course, data collection and learning, monitoring and evaluation, and research and learning. Learning is very important because most of these challenges that our countries face in Africa has somehow been faced by other countries in Latin America, in Asia, and then also in Europe. Some of it is partially solved. And if you really look at some of the EduTech blog, which is run by Michael Trucano at the World Bank, you can actually see that some of these challenges that we are facing in terms of infrastructure, in terms of content development, these have been solved somewhere. So the policy frameworks basically articulate these areas that the policymakers should look at. And finally, we also looked at that if we really move forward in terms of bringing ICT to everybody and then not leaving anyone behind, then there is a lot of investment that is required. There are some experiences in terms of improving access to finances for expanding access to ICTs. In some countries, sitting on millions of dollars of universal service fund, they kind of using that fund to connect schools. In Uganda, for instance, in Sudan. There are experiences in US, Morocco, Portugal, and Colombia and Turkey where special rates are also provided for schools. In Philippines, for instance, the private sector kind of come together and band together and provided resources. But I think there is a lot of resources that is required. But my inspiration actually comes from Rwanda, because as David says, this country inspires everyone. One of the inspiration that I have seen just yesterday was that the Kigali city is taking really a small step in terms of sustaining environment by simply removing carrier bags, plastic bags out of the country. Maybe you go to the shops in Kigali, then you will see that there is no carrier bags in Kigali. This is a simple step, which is really requires long-term vision, and then also multi-stakeholder partnership, because you have to work with the shops themselves. We have to work with people who produce the cardbox for carriers, and it also requires a bit of enforcement. Environmental management and quality of education for me are the same, because quality education sustains our development in Africa, I think, as described this morning. And then environment, it actually sustains our brain. And then, of course, it sustains our development. And good environment is also going to sustain our ecosystem. So I think we really need to take that kind of step, and everybody can chip in. The private sector can chip in, families can chip in. In the United States, for instance, families play a critical role in terms of providing, expanding ICTs in the schools. So families can chip in, donors can chip in, and then of course we can bring really that investment. I think if we commit, we can really move very forward. So in conclusion, I think we can leverage internet for quality education. We should not leave no child behind or no youth behind, whether they live in the most challenging area or whether they are in lived schools. I think we should actually start from the most difficult areas, because we can actually help, despite the challenge, we can actually connect those people in the rural areas. I was in Malawi and I saw these people strip the whole PC and give it a DC power supply and charging it with a battery and basically distributing it to the rural areas. I think that with good innovation, all these challenges are going to be surmountable, and we can really connect our schools not only in the urban areas but also in the rural areas. And I think we should also learn and exchange what is best and what has not been working. As I said, there is enormous amount of experience. One of the countries, for instance, cited is the Uruguay, that has really done enormous work in terms of expanding ICT in education. And of course, countries really need to evaluate where they are and move forward. And we have provided a scoreboard that the countries can really start with, and they can really actually take that and evaluate where they are, and then of course learn from others and move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lishan, for this very good and comprehensive summary of the report, Internet for Education in Africa. It was initially planned that we take like 5 to 10 minutes for Q&A, but because we are behind schedule, the organizers are suggesting that Lishan joins the panelists of the next session, so that you have the opportunity to ask questions, after this next session. So please, Lishan, you join us, and please join me again to thank him for this keynote. So, Michuki.